If you can time travel, then free will does not exist. Because you can travel into the future and come back to the present, and you will already know what is going to happen. But then you can argue that if you already know what's going to happen, but you can change what's going to happen, then free will does exist. Because then the future that you saw will no longer be true, and you'll do something that impacts the future. But then you can say that because you traveled into the future and you didn't like what you saw, you didn't like the result, so you came back to the present and did things differently so you can change the future. But then that was all predetermined, because you being able to know what's going to happen in the future made you change what was actually going to happen. So if you weren't able to travel into the future, everything would have remained the same. But because you saw the future and you didn't like it, you had to change what was actually going to happen. So there were factors that determined the choice that you made. And those factors could have been predestined. You was always meant to be able to travel into the future. And because you didn't like it, you traveled back into the present and changed what was actually going to happen. And now you have a different result. The future is now different. But then you can argue that when you time travel, you can't really travel into the future or the past. What you actually do is travel into an alternate timeline, and you influence or impact that alternate timeline. You either change the future, or you change the past, or you let it be. But then what happens in that alternate timeline was predestined or predetermined because you were able to travel into that alternate timeline to begin with. You impacted that alternate timeline and everything that happened there. You being able to travel into that alternate timeline was predetermined. Everything that happened, the way you impacted, was all predetermined by you being able to do that in the first place. So the lives of other people or yourself in that alternate timeline was impacted by you being able to travel there in the first place. But then you can say, because you can do that infinite amount of times, you can travel back in time or into the future forever, and because there's different possibilities, you're outside of the realm of destiny because you can change what actually happens. But then you can say that it was predetermined, that all of those possibilities was written in infinite ways so that infinite possibilities can happen, can exist. But perhaps those infinite possibilities and infinite results that you get from the different actions and the different impacts that you influenced or made was predetermined. All you did was create infinite alternate timelines, and you created those infinite possibilities. But all of that was predetermined because you were able to time travel. See, what happens is, think of it like a seed that grows into a tree. Over millions of years, you can see where it populates. What happens, if the tree will thrive or not, depending on where it spreads. But all of that, you can trace it back to the root. You can trace the different possibilities and the branches that it branches out all the way back to its root. So why were you able to time travel in the first place? Either you created a time traveling machine, or somebody created it or invented it. But because they were able to invent it and you happen to get your hands on it, you were able to time travel in the first place. And because of how you think and how you feel and who you are the way you are. But why are you the way you are? Because of how you grew up, your environment, things that happen in your life, your past. All of that influences you to make the decision that you make. So based on all of those factors and all the external and internal factors, you decided to time travel. So you time traveling in and of itself is predetermined or predestined because certain factors affect certain things. And if you know all the factors to a certain thing, then you know the certain result. The result is certain. There cannot be another way. The only way you get a different outcome is if you haven't factored something in, or if you didn't know something. You missed something. But if everything's a certain way, to perfection, there is no room for error because you know all the factors, then the result is certain. You can say a coin flip is random, but if you know who's flipping the coin, how strong he is, how he'll flip it, which side the coin is facing before you flip it, how hard he's going to flip it, how many spins it will flip based on a technique that he flips it with, what environment did he flip it in, Was there wind? Did the wind affect it? Does it hit a wall? Or are you in an open space? Where does it land? Does it land on a table? Does it land on a floor? How high was it? And when it lands, will it spin? How many times does it spin before it flattens? If you know all the factors, then you know how the coin will land. Was it a magician or was it an average person? Now, to the average person, that might seem like a random coin flip because they haven't thought of all the factors and they don't know how to calculate how it would land. But a higher intelligence that knows all the factors, that knows how that person is, how strong they are, how many spins and how many flips the coin will do in the air or on the ground before it flattens, based on a technique, and every factor was known to that higher intelligence because they can calculate everything. They are all knowing and they know everything. Then they know what the result will be based on all the factors. And to that higher intelligent being, the result was already known from the beginning. It was already predetermined. But to someone that doesn't know all of that, who doesn't take all of that into consideration, who didn't even have the thought process to think of that process, then it all seems random. We're programmed to do certain things, strive towards certain goals, how certain things affect us. Some people are stronger than others mentally. Some people deal with things better than others. Some people break down easily, but that's all due to the way we're built. Everything happens in the brain, but the brain is affected by the chemicals and hormones that you produce. Whether your body produces more or less is based on your genetics, based on what you eat, based on if you exercise or not, based on how you deal with things. Do you solve problems or do you let them be? Do you let things get worse? Because if you let things get worse, you might stress more. And if you stress for a long time, that can affect the way your body operates. Based on your genetics, how all of that even affects everything. Based on how you think. Everything that you do, every thought that you have is influenced by external things that impact you internally, that makes you do something. But all of that can be measured based on your lifestyle and genetics. And why do you have certain genetics? That can all be traced back to its roots. Who did your ancestors sleep with? Who did your ancestors mate with? What type of genes passed on? And what type of genes died out? How it mutated? All of that can be predestined or predetermined because you cannot control any of that. Some of the factors you can control, but do you really control it? Are you the originator of those factors? Or how it affected you? Or were you just programmed to be affected in that way based on your genetics and external factors that you can't control and the ones that you can control? But can you really control it if you let it affect you based on how you feel and the way you interpret logical reasoning that affect your decision making? Did you actually make that choice? Or did something made you make that choice? Things that happened, was it always meant to happen based on what happened in the past? That might have influenced someone else to be in your life. Think about going on a jog, you're outside jogging. What made you run into that person anyways? Maybe because that person wanted to go on a jog. But why did that person want to go on a jog in the first place? Perhaps he was motivated to exercise, but what motivated that person to exercise? Was it for health reasons? What affected that person and made them make that decision? Now, you can say free will is something that you have because you have a choice, whether or not you want to make that decision or not. But then that decision was made by your thinking process. What if you can only think that way at that time? You had no other thinking process at that time to even make a different decision. Now imagine someone who made a bad decision and they messed up their life. But maybe that was the only thinking process that they had at that time, based on how they grew up, based on what they were taught, based on how they interpret logic and how they let their feelings affect their decision making. They didn't even have the knowledge or the intelligence to make a better decision. No one taught them, and they weren't even in a situation where they could teach themselves. They didn't even have that experience to make a different decision. But then later on in life, because of the mistakes that they made and learning from those mistakes, they learn new things. They become more smarter. They become more intelligent. Now they make a smarter decision and they got their life together. But they would have never got their life together in the first place had they not made those mistakes, had they not learned from their mistakes. But not everyone learns from their mistakes. Perhaps some people are more arrogant than others. Perhaps some people think they're right all the time and they cannot be wrong, even though the result is not what they want. But they're so stubborn, they stick to their thinking process. But maybe all of that was predetermined. That's just who they are. And those willing to change and become better and become the best version of themselves, maybe that was predetermined because of how past events affect your decision making, but also your genetics, what makes you you. But then what made you have those genetics? What made you have stronger genes or weaker genes? Some people stress no matter what. Some people are happy no matter what. But that could be because of their genetic makeup that make them be that way. And why were those genes passed on? Well, you can all trace it back to its root. Who did your ancestors mate with? And what genes passed on and why? Because of the environment that they were in. Maybe certain genes had to be passed on for them to adapt and survive. And certain genes did not get passed on because it was useless. So all of that is out of your control. And if all those factors affect your decision making, then you were not the originator of those factors. Nor could you control it. Even the factors that you can control, could you really control it? Why did you let your emotions make that decision for you? What caused those emotions? Was it because you were stressed out? Why were you stressed out? What causes you to stress out? How come some people don't stress out in that situation, but you do? Why do some people handle it better than you do? It's your genetic makeup. Even the things that you think you can control, you cannot control. And you can think you made that decision because of logic. But why did you interpret logic in that way? Because everyone interprets logic in a different way. So why does your brain interpret it in that way? And what makes you, you? Your genetics. But why were those genetics passed on? Why were those genes passed on? You can trace everything back to its root and why it's the way it is. And you can predict what's going to happen if you know all the factors to something. It's only a possibility if you don't know all the factors, but you only know some of the factors. And the fact that everything could be calculated by math means everything was predetermined. Even if you have infinite possibilities, perhaps you from a different timeline would have made a different choice. And it starts branching out into the different lives you would have made based on the decisions that you would have made, the different decisions that you would have made. But all of that can be calculated by math, by possibilities, by what happens to you. Who do you run into? What affected you? Your past traumas, how you were raised. Whether you took certain opportunities will determine where you end up. And if you miss certain opportunities, then you might end up with a different outcome. You might end up somewhere else. But then you could live a life where you took certain opportunities and became successful, and you could live a life where you missed a certain opportunity and you were a failure. So even if you branch it out to different outcomes, all of that could be calculated by math. Now the argument to that is if it's just a possibility, there's a possibility that you might not make that decision. But math can be precise. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4 because you know all the factors. If you know all the factors that's involved in the decision making, then you already know what's going to happen. You already know the outcome. There can only be one outcome if you know all the factors. But then you can argue a person does not know all the factors. Well, just because you don't know how you were programmed, and just because you don't know all the factors, doesn't mean that decision wasn't already made for you. It was always just meant to happen. You don't know, but a higher intelligent being does know all the factors. So then in his mind, it was already predetermined. But to you, it seemed like a choice you could have made, but you didn't have to. To the human mind, perhaps they cannot factor in everything. Perhaps they cannot calculate math in a precise way to get 100% certainty of something happening. But for a higher intelligent being, someone who was able to create this whole universe, something that we humans cannot even fathom, that higher intelligent being already knows what's going to happen. And if they already know what's going to happen, then it was predetermined based on how you were programmed and all the factors that were put into the calculation. If the future already exists for you to even time travel in the first place, then that means everything was already written out. Everything was already predetermined in infinite ways because there's infinite possibilities, but all those possibilities was already written out in all the infinite alternate timelines.